Hi, everyone. I'm Akila. My pronouns are she, hers. We are the Chicago Health Coalition for Black Lives. We're a group of Chicago-wide health professionals and healthcare trainees organizing within and outside our institutions with Black and Brown revolutionary organizers on the grounds. This session is brought to you by our political education team, which aims to raise the critical consciousness of our base through these open access participatory curriculum. Could you go to the next slide, please? We are joined today by Hoyan Pham, and I'm gonna let Hoyan introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. So I'm Hoyan. I'm actually based in Michigan, so not Chicago, but still the Midwest. And I have been an organizer for a number of years now, primarily starting in immigration and then moving into abolition and labor, climate, and then further racial justice work. So currently I'm a digital organizer for an organization called We the People Michigan.
We want to add a brief access note, so please do what you need to do in order to be present. Maybe like you want to have your video on and engage that way, or you can have your video off if that's preferable for you. Just take care of yourself and do what you need to do. If you have any access needs, If you have any access needs that are not being met, please feel free to message myself, Camilla Zimmer, Taylor So, or Peter Lawrence, and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you. Next slide, please. Taylor, handing it off to you.
Hi, my name is Taylor. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a current M2 at UIC. I am going to share a similar blurb in the chat, and I invite anyone else that would like to introduce themselves and whatever else you would like to share with the group. We're going to be working together, so it would be nice to get to know each other early on. The next slide. So just a few grounding and working agreements. If you would like to join it, we encourage you to show up as you are. Be truthful. If you're willing to be vulnerable, then this is a safe space, and we are not trying to put anyone into an uncomfortable situation. If you don't feel comfortable speaking up, then we also want to encourage you to take care of yourself. If you're not as comfortable with your video on, then feel free to do what you need in order to be present in this space. This is going to be collaborative, so we encourage participation. We have a relatively small group, so I think if you want to unmute yourself and participate, that would be fine. If not, we'll also be monitoring the chat to make sure that we catch everyone's contributions. If you notice anything, can you go back really quick? And since this is collaborative, if you want to contribute anything else into these grounding agreements, then feel free to do so. So this can probably be a good basis for us. And then this is basically our agenda for the evening. We are going to just kind of zooming out a little bit. We are going to be looking at a real world issue and looking at more of a hypothetical solution. So we do want to remind everyone that this is a real world situation, and we don't have all the details to be able to plan an actual campaign right now, and everything is kind of compacted into this 1.5 hour long session. So with that in mind, we've kind of designed some of the critical components that are often done in parallel in more of a serial kind of format. So we're going to be unpacking an issue, doing a root cause analysis of that, describing why we are organizing in the first place, and then trying to strategically power map and try to effect the change that we would want to see. And then just some general pieces of wisdom from an organizer with some experience. We can just think of the components that will need to go into any future campaign that could come out of it. Next slide. Yeah, so like I said before, this is a real world problem that we are creating a hypothetical solution for. So often these components are an iterative process that you do a root cause analysis and then you get new information and you have to do another root cause analysis. Same thing with the power map. With all of that in mind, this is kind of a simplified version of the problem and any solution that we actually come up with. But with all of those caveats, we're going to be looking at the current closure of Mercy Hospital. And with that, I will pass it off to Peter.
Great, thank you, Taylor. Hi, everybody. My name is Peter. My pronouns are he, him. I'm currently a third-year medical student at Rosalind Franklin University. And as Taylor mentioned, we are talking about a real issue in our Chicago healthcare community tonight, and going to use that as sort of our foundation to talk about these different approaches to organizing a campaign. We don't expect anybody to become an expert on this in the process, but we do hope that maybe you're introduced to this if you haven't heard about it before. So Mercy Hospital is located here in the near south side, and it has 2 outpatient clinics associated with it here as well. And these are all going to close in probably between February and May of 2021, so very soon. And I put this slide on here just so we can see the very large area that will be much further away from a hospital once this closure occurs. So to give you a little context, again, don't expect anybody to memorize this. There'll be no pop quiz at the end. But Mercy is an old hospital founded in 1852. In 2012, it joined Trinity Health, which is a giant health system based in Michigan that has like 90 hospitals and almost $20 billion a year in revenue. This system also owns the Loyola Medical Center, which is its only other Chicago hospital. Mercy serves a large proportion of underserved and underinsured and Medicaid patients, about 80% of its population, a lot of whom rely on public transit to get to their health care. It employs over 2,000 people, most of whom are not physicians. I know a lot of us are in medical school here. And it's currently operating at a loss of about $4 million a month, which, given how much money the parent healthcare system is pulling in, isn't really that large percentage-wise. There was a plan proposed a year ago or so where 3, I hate to use the term like money losing, but that's our healthcare system, but 3 hospitals on the south side, 4 hospitals, Mercy, Advocate Trinity, South Shore, and St. Bernard, had proposed merging, building a couple new hospitals and closing the old ones, building some outpatient clinics, and forming a consortium for Southside Healthcare. And they were proposing getting about $500 million from the state over, I believe, 5 years to help fund this. And it should be noted that the state is already putting a lot of money into these hospitals because they are not profitable. And unfortunately, that's a prerequisite for staying open in our healthcare system right now. So that plan was put forward. And then the spring legislature session ended in May of this year. They never voted on this bill. And that is what prompted these current plans for closure. And it should also be noted that this is something that's affected this community recently as well, where Michael Reese, which was another nearby hospital, closed down in 2009. So again, there'll be a pretty large geographic area that doesn't have a hospital if Mercy were to go ahead and close in the spring of next year. So the next item we're going to move on to is just sort of unpacking this issue a little bit more and reflecting on who we are as we approach this situation. And Hoi An is going to lead this section.
Cool, thank you. All right, yeah, so now that we've got the grounding of that issue, the scenario is really about us putting ourselves in the situation, right? So when we ask who we are, is there anybody who maybe has ideas? You can go off mute, you can put that in the chat of what this group is and who's in this group right now. So let's pretend that you are just trying, you just heard about this issue for the first time, maybe that's true. And you're just trying to see like, oh shit, like this is awful, like what can we do about it? Let's think about the group that you're already part of. So does anybody want to just shout out some answers or just stick it in the chat about what this particular group of people is? Awesome. Yeah, I'm seeing med students and healthcare workers, Chicago. Sorry, I'm not going to say that. I don't know how to say it. Chicagoans. Perfect. Yeah, that's what this group is, and medical professionals, and all of you are for some reason involved in this, have a stake in this in some way, because that's who you are. So what makes you interested in this issue, and why do you care? Yeah, social justice, caring about healthcare in general, right? Scheduled to rotate at Mercy. There's some personal stake here. Those are perfect. That's great. People on the South Side already experience health disparities. Yeah, and Kelly, what you said also ends up merging a little bit into the last question as well, which is who cares about this issue, right? So when we start thinking of these questions, and we want to start unpacking an issue, that's also when we want to start thinking about who else is involved and who can we first talk to about this, right? So when you hear about something for the first time, maybe in this scenario, what is something that you often do? Are you immediately running off and like talking to somebody that you don't know? Or maybe are you going a little bit closer to home, right? Has anyone ever maybe like shared an issue on their like Instagram story, or maybe texted a couple of their friends about what's going on, or maybe their coworkers about what's going on? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. So this would definitely be like, pretend that we're in the issue right now. We really want to be grounding ourselves in who we are, why we're interested, and then start thinking about who cares. And once we've sort of gathered just like ourselves and our close friends together, which isn't a lot of work, right? Because hypothetically, we're talking to those folks already. We're already talking to our coworkers because you have to see them every day, unfortunately. And we already have that circle of folks who we know, like, hey, these people might have a stake in this issue, and these people might have an interest in what's going on. Yeah, and thanks, Peter. Other folks that would care, patients and friends and family of patients. Awesome. So I think we can move on to the next slide, which is looking at root cause analysis, right? So once we've gathered everybody together in a room, we can start to think about, okay, so like we care and we're here, but why does this issue exist in the first place, and where is it coming from, right? Because it didn't drop out of nowhere. So I'll kick it back to Peter to answer those.
Great, thank you for that. So when we start to look at a problem that we have decided bothers us, and we've started kind of building a little context for our engagement in it, I think it should sort of come intuitively that we don't want to just put a Band-Aid on something or just look at a symptom. But what's really going on is going to inform, like, our understanding of what's really going on is going to inform how we move forward, who else we try to engage with or build alliance with, what kind of tactics and strategy we use. So developing an analysis of a situation is a really important initial process when you're starting to think about a particular issue you want to organize around. So first, this may be a little bit of seem like kind of a silly question, but I would love folks to just throw out some ideas of like what is a root cause? Like, how is a root cause not just what's right in front of us? If anybody wants to throw something in the chat or unmute yourselves, say hi. Great, yeah, thank you, Kelly. Maya, absolutely. Poverty, racism, So these are big systemic root causes that have a lot of manifestations. One of which is the disinvestment from South and West Side communities in Chicago, and that looks like the closure of a hospital like Mercy in the middle of a pandemic simply because it's not making money. Yep, that's a really good one. So this one, thanks, Mags. That's like redlining in the affected area leading to outside control of healthcare infrastructure. So lack of local control, and the sort of policies that have been going on for a long time, resulting in that. I think another one to throw out in this context is the fact that we have a for-profit healthcare system, the fact that we're looking at the revenue stream of a particular hospital to decide whether or not it's worthy to stay open without first considering what its role is in that community, just as a way to maybe tie this immediate issue to a larger issue that has a lot of national organizing around it, which is like the single payer movement. And so we've talked about some things that get at the cause of the cause, if you will, but the sort of like underlying conditions that it emerges out of. I think it's important to note when we look at these poverty, racism, redlining, for-profit healthcare system, that these aren't separate things, right? That it's sort of an interconnected system or network of issues that is causing this manifestation that's doing harm and affecting us and causing us to act in some way. So now that we are developing a little bit of an analysis around it, we've already kind of talked about who else is impacted, but that's something that, again, you may want to reconsider as you build that analysis. So let's talk a little bit about why this is happening and what can be done to prevent it from happening again, whether we're talking in the short term of keeping Mercy open through next spring or in the long term of not having divestment from healthcare infrastructures and communities that need it. Great, Taylor, absolutely. So the acquisition that was proposed was like there was a proposal put forward to keep Mercy open. Yep, and the legislature rejected the funding. So that's a very like immediate, specific, and short-term issue that didn't happen. And that presents a potential target, right? Depending on what kind of goals we set for this campaign. Having that analysis is important. Does anybody else have any suggestions for sort of short-term or longer-term goals that would present sort of an organizing target? Okay, so I think, changing the funding for hospitals, longer term policy goals around single payer and reinvestment in community. Exactly. So just challenging our healthcare system in general. I think that's one of the ways that we can make our organizing not just issue specific, but also movement building, where we recognize the ways that it's connected to these larger issues that have a lot of different manifestations, and we don't need to separate this issue from that. Even if we end up developing short-term goals that get the legislature to pass this goal, recognizing that it's connected to a lot of different layers of change and timescales of change is definitely a worthwhile exercise. So next we're going to move into talking a little bit about how we come into this space and our values and intentions in this space. And I will turn it back over to Hoi An for this section.
Thanks. Yeah, so you all were able to outline some of the bigger structural issues that are going on, right? What's the landscape, the political landscape, or the socio-political landscape that we're in Chicago, in the US, globally more generally, which is a for-profit healthcare system, right? Where there are a lot of people, particularly Black and brown folks, who are being sort of like tossed aside and overlooked and not cared for in the system that we're in. And a lot of outside control of healthcare infrastructures, right? Those are the big issues that we're looking at. But what's important for us to think about too, particularly hypothetically, in our group of folks who want to be doing work around this issue, is who we are, right? And where we're coming into this work and where we are positioned in that current context. And that's talking about positionality. And positionality more loosely is just defined as the stance or positioning that you are in relation to the social and political context of the environment that you're in. So, you know, a lot of this, sorry, that's our oven. A lot of where positionality will come into play, you can see some examples here, right, on the slide. If you, I'm not sure if folks can read that clearly, but some of the things could be sexuality, your occupation, your race, your education, your ethnicity. Positionality differs from privilege in the way that it looks at where you are, right? And that becomes a little bit more useful for us because one person doesn't just have all privileges and nothing else, right? We all have differing identities that make us, that really influence how we are, how we think, how we grow up, right? So, you know, just using a personal example, I was raised in a working class family with a single parent. I was a first generation American. And we, let's see, I didn't get to go to the best schools when I was like a lot younger. And also, I grew up in a really rich county. I had citizenship and my mom had citizenship as well. And also, English was one of my first languages. So there's a lot going on there where there are some things in which, yeah, like that wasn't really a benefit to me growing up. And also it's wrapped up in a package of where I was able to grow up and the things that I was able to experience based on my location geographically, based on my citizenship status in a country that cares a lot about citizenship status, and based on my ability to know a language fluently. That's really important even in a country that doesn't officially have an official language. And what that led me to do was really be able to, the reason that I got into organizing in the first place was because I was able to look at my identity as a child of refugees, a child of immigrants, and I got into immigration justice work. So we wanted to give everybody a little bit of time if you were willing to think about maybe some of your own positionalities and what that led you to think about and what that led you to be fighting for in your own day-to-day life. So we'll give like maybe just 30 seconds for folks to think about it. And if you would like to, I would love it if people would share in the chat. Awesome, thank you, Peter. Yeah, Peter Rowe, I moved to Chicago for school and live on the north side, so I don't have a personal relationships to the community Mercy, to the community that Mercy serves. Yeah, that's something to definitely think about, right? When we were talking previously about who you are as a group, who this group is as medical professionals, what does it mean for you all, you know, for a lot of you to actually not be growing up or to not have grown up and not be part of the patients that you're serving every day? What does it mean for you to have the status of a medical professional, even if you were not someone who came from privilege? That's definitely something that affords you a certain amount of authoritative knowledge in any situation. Yeah, I think that's a great example. And obviously no need to share, but if folks keep on thinking of it, feel free to type it in the chat and we can move on from this to the next slide. So the reason that we want to begin identifying positionality is because it helps us really try to reckon with what's bringing us to this fight, why we care about a specific issue, what privileges we hold and how we can leverage them, and who we're accountable to in this work, right? And so people often tend to see, particularly pulling out, let's see, the third one, people often see solidarity as something that's really like contractual, right? So I help you with something and then you will help me with something, or I show up somewhere and then you will show up somewhere for me. And in reality, when we're talking about solidarity, it should be something that's transformative and centered on collective liberation, right? And this came out of the Combahee River Collective. It came out of a ton of other Black queer femmes work. And what this means is that the recognition that in order to fight for our own liberation, we must fight with others for theirs as well. So that also means that we need to find how we're personally connected to the work that we're doing, because that helps us identify the folks that we're accountable to and accountable with, and who we can be, who's in our community, right? Okay, I think we can move to the next slide here. What positionality also helps us really identify our shared values and intentions, right? So the reality is that we don't actually know everything as individuals. We probably don't know, like the amount that I know is a fraction compared to what this group knows together, right? I mean, besides the fact that you all are med students and I'm not, so you know a lot there and I don't, but also we all come from different experiences. We all come from different backgrounds, and together we have a collective knowledge that can be really, really powerful. And a lot of so you know, a lot of the learning that I do, a lot of the things that I've been able to gain in my organizing experience is by doing it with other people. So like for me personally, when I came into immigration organizing, I was lucky enough that one of my first campaigns was led by 3 older undocumented folks from Mexico. And they were able to really introduce to me the value of coming together collectively, bringing in culture and bringing in their full selves for the full work. So we were always celebrating with food, we were celebrating with music, we were tying in all the full parts of ourselves and not coming into this work with just half of who we were or a quarter of who we were, really. Just in acknowledgement that this work is bringing in everybody and it's actually happening in the real world. So when we're talking about this with you all as med students too, what does it look like for you all to be coming in to doing this work, to fighting for a hospital to not close with your full selves of not just medical students, but also people who are coming from all these different backgrounds and all these different identities. So thinking about shared values and intentions, what are you all fighting for and against in this particular hypothetical fight? Awesome, thank you, Matthew. Yeah, so Matthew said, access to healthcare for the community around Mercy, equitable healthcare, structural competence. Yeah, that would be great, and great. And so, why, in that sense, when we're fighting for this to happen, what are the values that we're putting around that? And I think Cammie's answer is great there. Cammie, I don't know if you wanted to go off mute and say it, or if you just wanted me to read that out loud for you.
I'll just read out aloud what I wrote, which is that I believe in securing access to healthcare for everyone, healthcare that's affirming, empowering, free. And I understand that that isn't just the patients I might see, but also the people around me, even the neighbors like on the south side who I might not ever see in my practice.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you, Cammie. And Izzy, did you want to hop off of mute for a second and share what you wrote as well?
Oh yeah, sure. So in the chat, I wrote, that I'm fighting for my firm belief in healthcare as a human right. Like a personal background, I was able to get health insurance for most of my childhood upbringing through my mother, through her job. And, so was my father, given the fact that he was on a green card and didn't have a job that would provide healthcare. And so it's something that like I don't really take for granted. And I think about healthcare access a lot. So with something like Mercy, it's inextricably tied to healthcare access.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Megs, I love your comment, leadership and Ella Baker's definition. That's a value or intention that you have. I don't know how many folks on this call are familiar with Ella Baker. I didn't know if you wanted to expand on that. And if you don't, that's also okay.
Sure. I use it because my background in this stuff is coming from a lay professional or like a community side. So not someone who is a medical professional, but someone who works with them as a patient or as a community member. And Ella Baker is oft quoted for many other things, but in this context, her idea was that strong people don't require strong leaders. So if you give everyone the skills and the knowledge, then they can work together from a position of knowledge and power. So they don't have to look to one icon or one person that will save them, but rather can work together collaboratively. So it's kind of like a way of deprofessionalizing all these things so that people are equal partners in creating change.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ella Baker is a great person to be reading about or looking up. A lot of it is how we can build people up and how we can have people see how everybody can really be like a leader themselves and how we can be building leaderful movements, which is really empowering to be thinking about when a lot of people are coming together for the first time, right? Oftentimes, one of my friends, Kay, who I think did a workshop for you last week, something that they have said is that a lot of times, like, we're looking around for a person to be doing something, and a lot of times that person is us, right? What is the power that we can have together? I love, thank you so much to all of you who shared here. So the reason that we talk about sharing our values and intentions, and especially sometimes so early in this campaign, right, still in the hypothetical, is because we really want to be knowing who we're fighting with and why we're fighting together. And when we share our values and we share our intentions with each other, we know why we're fighting, not just for ourselves and for what we believe in, but also for the communal, right? Everybody in this group has said that they support accessible healthcare. They support healthcare for folks. They support folks wanting to come into their own and people wanting to come into their own and be leaders, right? And that's really important. A quick flag here, what we're not doing is we're not having specific goals yet for our campaign. But what we are doing is saying, in this nebulous group of folks that we've gathered here today, these are the reasons why we're here, and this is what we want to fight for. And now we have a direction to go and sort of a compass to point of what we want to look for and what we're going to try to, what work we're going to try to get involved in as a whole. Awesome. So I think we can move on to the next slide. And what that helps us do is it helps us try to think about who we want to work with and what and who is there. So if we want to, we're going to look into that through power mapping. Has anyone on this call heard of power mapping before? Some folks, cool. So a power map can really help clarify all the things that are on the slide right now that I will not read off. But what it really is to win a campaign, and a lot of this is adapted from Beautiful Rising, you need to identify who has the power to fix the problem you want fixed. So a couple slides back, we had talked about looking at the root cause, right? And looking at the bigger socio-political context of where we're in Chicago, in the world, and then also how we're situated in there. But what power mapping does is it helps us to name specific players in that system and what ways we can either be leveraging their power or identifying them so that we actually know how to fight back against their power. So it looks at who has the power to fix the problem. So who's up there, right? Who are the folks who are at the top? What power do we hold as individuals? So Mags brought up, we have a lot of power as individuals that we can come into. That's really cool. And also what power does our positionality individually lend us? What does it as a collective lend us? Who has influence over this power? That's repeated again, I think, an accident, but also very important to think about. And then how do we apply pressure, right? So how are we using all of this power that we've identified in order to actually get what we want? And what a power map looks like, oops, we can go to the next slide, that doesn't help that. A power map will identify stakeholders. So what people do at institutions, and also just in general names of people who are, I guess you could call them political actors or just actors in general in the system that we're talking about. And what this starts like is literally just making a list. We'll try to make it look a little bit prettier in a little bit. But the first thing really is just let's make a list of the folks that we know might be involved in this. So this is something that we're going to do together. And when we think about stakeholders, we want to think about those responsible for creating the problem, those who have powers to fix the problem but aren't doing so, those who are geographically relevant, so who's in the area, right? We talked about redlining. So who's on one side of the red line and who's on the other? Those folks, who's in charge of redlining in the first place? Where are those folks now? Who are folks who are impacted by this issue? We've pulled out a couple of those groups already. Who's working to fix the problem? And also, who are you, right? So we talked about positionality because we want people to be able to situate themselves and their power and their privilege into this conversation as well. An important thing to think about when we think about power mapping is that how many of you have heard somebody say, like, oh, like those at the top are the ones who are just fucking everything up for all of us, or like it's the 1% who are the ones, you know, who are doing this and they just need to pay more money. Yeah, all that stuff is true. Definitely true. Definitely that's happening. And also those people have names and addresses, right? We're not fighting systemic racism. I mean, we are, but also systemic racism, the people are pushing forward systemic racism who have names and addresses, and they have money that's flowing to them to some way, and we can follow that money, and we can take it from them, right? So when we turn this power mapping into specific names and institutions that we know, that helps us to actually figure out what the heck are we doing? Because we can have a pretty map and that map can tell us absolutely nothing. But when we're able to actually name the stakeholders, the names, and answer these questions in full, we can actually get somewhere with where we're going. So I can give you an example of what a power map looks like. So, and then Akila and Peter and Taylor are gonna lead us into actually drawing one out for ourselves. It looks a little bit like a web. So there are lots of different versions. This is just one. Where in the center, you can have someone that we're gonna target. So let's pretend that we wanna target Mr. X local official. I don't know a lot of your local officials in Chicago, so maybe just picture one in your head and hold it there for a second. And then we wanna look at, okay, who actually pressures that person, who's around them, and what does that look like, right? So maybe I see Mrs. X is pointing to Mr. X local official. Maybe that's Mr. local official's wife. We'll pretend he's unfortunately straight. And he's married to this person, and that person can pressure them. And maybe that person belongs to a local charity, and that local charity can pressure Mrs. X to do things because Mrs. X cares a ton about her public image and about her philanthropy, and she wants that to look good, right? You can also look at some other folks around here. So we have tribal leaders, religious leaders, a rich and powerful citizen. In what ways is money talking, right? There's someone who's a tailor of Mr. X and an owner of the local newspaper. And here we're getting a little bit creative, right? So you see someone who's just the tailor. That's not someone that you might ordinarily think of, but in what ways can we get at people in all aspects of their life? As a personal example, in one of the first campaigns I did to stop a woman being deported, we actually targeted her church and her pastor because we knew where she went to church, and we were like, hey, when we literally went outside there and started pressuring them to pressure her to not deport this woman. So there are lots of ways that we can start to be creative about where power is and who can influence people. It doesn't just have to be, you know, a building or an official institution, but it can also be the names of people who you know are in their inner circle. And when you start getting that additional information, you can start having more detailed power maps. So this one looks like this, and that is the one that we will be making. But also when we get more detailed, it can start to look like the next slide here, which starts to map people out on how they strongly disagree or strongly agree with you on an issue against how much power they have. So like my sister in Boston probably doesn't have that much power over housing in Ann Arbor, which is where I'm from. But maybe the housing director of my county agrees with me and has a lot more power because that's their jurisdiction, for example. And then it can also, I think the next one is another example as well. It can also start to look like this, right? And as you can see, as we get more and more detailed into these, it also becomes more and more helpful for us to actually look at what's going on, right? Because we start to not only map out people, but we start to map out problems, those people's agendas, looking at who's actually a decision maker, where people stand, where they agree with us on the issue. It starts to map out a campaign for us. And so now we're actually going to move into us practicing this ourselves. I'm going to kick it over to Peter and Akila and Taylor to do that. And actually, I think we have time. Mags, did you want to expand upon your comment? You don't have to. I don't want to scare anybody.
Sure, I can. I think it's interesting that these campaign, even the word campaign, but all these things are structured as if we were at war, which does kind of, I think, prejudge, I don't know what the word is, but pushes us in a certain way about conceiving enemies versus like allies. And that oftentimes, especially when it's not an individual who has like an out and out agenda that says like, you know, fuck you, or I'm going to destroy this because I hate you, like it can push us towards certain strategies or tactics that might be effective in one arena or one theater of that, but that might be less effective than other ones. But it's very hard to kind of navigate that sometimes because of the way that we can have righteous indignation or like real anger about things. I don't have an answer. It's an interesting framework for campaigns and social change to use the kind of language and ideology of war.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting point to bring up. We are going to talk more about allies and specific tactics a little bit later. I think particularly, you know, when we start to talk about campaigns just in general and social justice stuff, there is sort of a, I guess, dialogue that we won't get into on this of like, we are in a war in a sense, right? Like there is violence and there has been genocide on this land, and like a lot of people have been in war for a long time. And also I think more to what you were referring to is in what ways does our language and attitudes and I guess like mindsets over these issues, how can those play a role in who we see as allies and who might be allies and how we approach a situation. And I think that can be something that we address too when we talk about like one-on-ones and building relationships and who are people really that we want to bring into this work. And I think that's a good flag to think about when we're power mapping in terms of like who are people that have power and might strongly disagree with us in some ways, but maybe in some other ways they will agree with us. And how can we navigate that with nuance, and how can we navigate that with actually sticking to our values as a group and as individuals. So yeah, I think that's a really good flag and something to think about as well. But yeah, Akila and Peter and Taylor, I'll kick it back to you.
Great. I'm going to pull up a document here. We can move through this slide. Just a quick note, as we've mentioned before, that all of these are going to be probably iterative processes that you return to in the course of building an actual campaign. So as you get more information, you may build more sophisticated power maps. As you pick different targets, you may map them out just for that. So just something to keep in mind. So let's go ahead and do one for ourselves and start with a list. Again, because none of us are necessarily experts on the Mercy situation, we can keep it general. We don't necessarily need names, just offices or things like that. But let me pull up another document here. And sorry, I am
Peter, do you just want to go to the Google Doc for the stakeholder list, and then we can go to the Jamboard to make the list into a web?
Yeah, so here, can you see it? I have it up
Yep,
on.
we can see
Okay.
it.
Okay, great.
That's the perfect length, yep.
Let me pull up the chat here. So we've got Mercy closing because in February to May of next year, who are our stakeholders in this situation? Don't all talk at once. I mean, we want to make sure that everybody's got, okay, great. So we got people who work at the hospital, local state officials, excellent. Older people. Lori fucking Lightfoot, absolutely. It actually is her middle name, can confirm. Other local hospital systems, yep.
Another one I just copied from the chat is the CEO of Trinity.
Yes, missed that. Sorry about that, Bree. Yep. So each of these, I think Kelly brings up a great point that each of these groups also exist in communities as well that are affected by this. So the friends and family of people that work at Mercy and of patients as well. We've got the EMS corps corps that Max just mentioned. So the folks that are working with Mercy and bringing folks to Mercy, the local neighborhood around the hospital. I think in the case of Mercy, for like folks that work at the hospital, are they, that can even be broken down? Like, are they trainees? Are they union? So the public health department, state representative and state senator. So as you can see, this list gets big quickly. There's a lot of people that are invested in this and that have to do with a decision like this as well. So I think this is a great list of a lot of people that are in the Mercy ecosystem right now, and that either are affected by this closure or can affect whether or not this closure happens. So let's go ahead and take this list and just start sort of plotting out some relationships and thinking about who composes these groups. There may be only one CEO, but there's 2,000 employees, and a lot of them at least do have union representation. Let me put these lists side by side here. These Google Docs. Okay. So who's got a suggestion on sort of who we want to center here? Okay, sorry, I'm just opening the chat back up again. Got a question from Megs. How might y'all differentiate? Megs, would you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Sure. I guess my question, especially because I'm in Oakland, California right now, and there's a lot of legislation that says these are certain ways that things have to go, that lay out very specific power relationships between especially different like city or legislative bodies, but that's just on paper. It doesn't actually like transform into real power. And so like, I was curious how, at least in this context, because you have a good example, how you would differentiate between what is the stated power relationship between, say, Lori Lightfoot and, I don't know, some stakeholder versus the kind of real world power, the like hard power versus soft power kind of thing, or what is actually the dynamic versus, because knowing what the law says versus what's real might be a useful distinction, I guess. Does that make sense?
It does. I think it's an excellent point as well. I think that in the context of this example, what we would want to do as we kept going through this process is answer a series of questions about each of these individuals as well. So, I mean, first of all, who are these officials? What is the union representation at the hospital? Like, fill out some of those details, and then ask like where they stand and what power they hold. And so I think as we would go through that what power do they hold question, whether it is like purely ceremonial or on paper versus legal versus soft and subtle or behind the scenes, I think those are, as we went through this, we went through this process in an iterative fashion and it got more complex, those are questions that we would want to answer. And that's the reason that Hoi-An introduced sort of those escalating complexity of power maps as they start to contain more and more information. So here in this example, we decided to like not bring in that level of detail. But in this being sort of, okay, this is the first process, let's just like get something on the whiteboard and get a sense of the landscape. I think if this were a real world example, really the first thing we would do is to try to answer those questions and learn that information. Because again, I think the case we're trying to make is that going into that level of detail of both the type of change you're trying to make and then the ecosystem, the socio-political ecosystem that change would exist in, or the resistance it would encounter, is key for actually planning an efficacious and meaningful campaign that's not just performative. So that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. So given that we only have a limited amount of information and we're using this as sort of our first pass at this, let's build out a little bit of a power web for what, given our current level of understanding. So I think one group, just to get it started, is that community members. Great. So Bree, putting the community at the center. Love that. So we can do that there. So Bree and Kelly both suggest, putting community there at the center. And who are some folks that community is directly going to have some influence over or interact with or have some access to? So elected officials, yep. Press, local businesses, absolutely. And I hope as we start to look through these, I hope folks are getting a sense of how much detail can go into this. Press, there's a number of publications in Chicago, some of which are going to be more sympathetic to community organizing than others. Neighborhood activists and organizers, that's so important, of who's already there, who's already doing this work, what networks already exist. Absolutely.
And I think as we're also drawing arrows or lines in between each other, press is something that also has an influence on elected officials and local business too, right? Oftentimes I think, particularly when I was a student organizer in undergrad, something we would try to hit first was press and try to get that up to national press, because publicity costs a lot of money, and it's not something that you can take back pretty easily. So that can definitely be something that influences other folks.
And I think, you know, one thing to consider in this context as well, or one of the like utility of a power map like this, is it's likely that the community doesn't directly have access or leverage over the CEO of Trinity. But through their elected officials and through press, they can sort of bridge that gap and apply pressure to folks like the CEO of Trinity.
Is that the CEO of Trinity or the CEO of Mercy? Or I guess both.
Either, both, yeah. And I think this is one of the reasons that it's useful to break things down into names and sort of be specific when you can as well. You know, as Hoyan so eloquently put it, these people have names and addresses. And you know, and I think one of the ways that the system sort of tries to hide the harm it's done is through that anonymity, through the sort of like, oh well, it's just the bureaucracy or just the way things are. So really breaking that down, I think, is an important process. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, Maya. So Maya says, feel like there's maybe an overlapping bubble of community and people who work at Mercy that could be important to capture. Absolutely. So a lot of folks in the community are also going to work there, and the community will be very affected by the loss of those jobs should the hospital close. Yeah, so putting them close together like that is great. Yeah, so great point, Hoyan, of donors to the hospital would impact both the CEO and elected officials. They're probably folks who donate to other issues and donate to campaigns as well. So these are going to be probably more wealthy and powerful folks in the area. And they may be connected to local businesses. Great. So I don't think we need to go through every single person on this list, but I hope this is illustrating that a big problem, like a huge hospital closing, that there are connections between you know activists and organizers, which we can include ourselves in, community members, and routes to apply pressure in the places that are appropriate. And that through this power mapping exercise, and particularly back to Mag's point, like as you start to develop more of a nuanced understanding of the situation and incorporate more information into this analysis, it's really going to start to make it clear what targets are and sort of the pressure points are to begin to leverage to try to build an effective campaign. Does anybody have anything else they want to add on this example or this point before we move on to the next slide?
Great. So as we took a look at the power map, there were definitely some folks that we probably don't want to fuck with, right? But then there are also folks that we identified who maybe were like, maybe these people care about the same things that we do, or maybe they're ones who have already been invested in this fight, have a higher stake than we do. And so our next step organically then is, if we want to organize against closing Mercy Hospital, let's reach out to those folks, right? The reason that we want to do this is because, we can go to the next slide, we want a lot of organizing is about relationships. So a lot of times building relationships really meaningfully is the key to building power for a successful grassroots movement. What this doesn't mean is that everybody you organize with has to be your best friend, right? I mean, I think even going back to Mag's point earlier about who we're organizing with and like who we're perceiving and organizing general, the landscape, it isn't something that has to be like you love everybody that you're with and you love everything about them and you just want to be around them all the time. I organize with people who I think are so annoying, and I really wish that they would stop being annoying. But that's okay, because we understand that at the end of the day, we have the same shared values around what we're organizing around, and we're both committed to this fight. Yeah, nobody on this call. Everybody is great. That's actually true. I wouldn't have said that if I thought anybody would feel called out. And this is something that I think you all have experience with in terms of how you can build a relationship with folks, right? Like when you're building relationships with your patients, when you're building relationships with your fellow med students, you're doing so because you're in so for the long haul and because you have the same commitment, right? So like with your patients, you and the patient, I hope, are both committed to the patient getting better. With your med students, you're hoping, maybe in a less competitive environment, you're hoping that everybody can kind of pull through and be together. And so if we talk about relationships, that's something that we really want to be prioritizing and organizing, because it can help us push our work forward. And it also in part is the work, right? If we're really fighting for healthcare, we're not just fighting for healthcare as like to exist, we're fighting for people to have the healthcare. We care about people as a collective, even if we don't like them. Even if I don't like you, I still hope that you have healthcare, right? And that's why building relationships with folks is so important. So if you can go to the next slide. A lot of the ways in which we do, oh shoot, yeah, I forgot about that. That also helps us look at allies and opponents, right? So looking at the power map, we saw all of the different groups and different people that we could work with. And what you can do is you can look at this on a spectrum of allies. So really quickly looking at who is active, so who's already active in this fight to not shut down Mercy Hospital, who's like out there and already emailing people, already super fired up, and maybe who's less so, who's like, they're gonna like your post on Facebook, like a quick click, and they're not gonna do anything else, right? And so we can look at that as like of the pyramid engagement here. So maybe the passive person is someone who's just observing. They're looking at your posts, they're saying, oh, that's cool, and they're not actually out there with you. And if we can go to the next slide, I think all of us have people who are passive folks in our lives, right? So there are, of course, if we just think about our own Facebooks, everybody on this call is around the same age, so we all still have Facebook, thank God. And who are the people in your life who are just liking the posts? Not like your parents or whatever. It could be your parents, but even just friends that you don't know that well, or friends that you've never talked about politics to. And in what ways can we be building relationships with them and pushing them to the next step? Because if you think of who you're going to show up to a rally with and who you're going to organize with, you're not, oftentimes, hopefully, you're not going by yourself. And you're also not going to pull a stranger to go with you. You're going to pull someone who you know, but maybe you've never been in that context with them before. And that might have been for folks who've been to a rally, right? Yeah, Bernie says, I'm once again asking you to come to a rally with me, to have a little treat with your cat with me. And in what ways, think of your first organizing experience. Who was the person who pulled you to it, right? Maybe it was someone you'd never been to this before, but you'd done other stuff before together. And through this, we do something called one-on-ones. I have these like 5 times a week, and it's really intentional conversations with folks where you talk about yourself, you talk about your journey a little bit. You don't have to get that deep. And also, you really talk about your shared values and intentions and why you want to work on this thing together, why you're glad to be in community together, and how you are. So it's a conversation to get to know and be known, telling your story and hearing others, an inquiry into what matters to that person, and a chance to identify and build up new organizers and leaders. So oftentimes it ends with a commitment of like, hey, do you want to come to this rally with me? Or hey, do you want to come to this meeting with me because you said that you were interested in this one thing that I posted on Facebook? Now I'm going to talk to you, and hopefully now you can come to this meeting with me. You can come join CHC4BL, right? It isn't like an interview or a survey or something that's purely task oriented, right? Like we're not going there and we're not pulling out a notebook and being like, all right, I'm just going to check off these boxes. It is something that should flow naturally, and we're having a conversation with each other, but it is just with the intention of like, hey, I heard that you were interested in this social justice thing nebulously, and I'd love to learn what that is because I am too, and how can we move forward together and build that relationship together? So really quickly, that's what a one-on-one is. And that's a lot of movements. You'll notice too, if you start to track organizing movements throughout history, the relationships that people have with each other track across movements and across generations in a really, really, really cool way. So you can go to the next slide. And next, we're just going to talk about different types of campaigns. And then Peter, I think that's you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So just to sort of ground ourselves in where we're at, I know we've gone through a lot of information in the last hour or so. We have found an issue and sort of identified why we care about it and why we're engaged in it. We've set some values and some intentions around this that are going to guide how we move into this space, with whom we organize and in what forms we organize. We've started to look critically at this issue and figure out what's really going on. Why is this happening? What are the structures of power around it that are causing it to happen and that could prevent it from happening? And as we've developed that analysis and that sense of place in this issue, we've started reaching out to build alliances, to bring individuals into our cause, to work with other groups that are working on this as well, and really started the relationship and trust building in the context of organizing. And so now this sort of nebulous thing that we started with 70 minutes ago, or a couple weeks ago, if maybe this was in the real world, is starting to become something that's starting to take shape a little bit. And now we're ready to start actually acting on our analysis of power, and actually trying to affect some change in the real world. And so we want to now move into a conversation just about what does exerting pressure and creating power and expressing that power, what does that look like? So I think we've all probably been somewhat aware of the massive uprising that is going on in the United States over the last couple months. If not, check the news. It's been a pretty exciting time. So I'm sure we've seen a lot of this recently, but I would just love to hear from folks, like, what do y'all think of when you think of a campaign or an organizing tactic that's trying to affect some type of change? It's great. Door-to-door canvassing. Absolutely. So it's a way of both, educating members in the community about this issue, and also exerting some pressure on elected representatives as well. It's a great one. Thanks, Matt. So protest, mobilizing for public comment on rulings or legislation. Yep. Social media, like hashtag campaigns, phone banking. Kelly, I'm curious what you mean when you say it feels so big.
Everything that's happening, just even like organizing an action feels nearly insurmountable, even though you've broken it down in this really great way, that just I've seen in history, small groups of people can do really big things. I just didn't know we were a small group of people who could do a really big thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's, and I think we can sort of take a moment to reflect on that, because it really does feel big. And I think that's why this process is so important, because the problems that the world faces are so big. It doesn't just feel big, it really is. And so taking the steps to connect yourself into the larger ecosystem of dots and figure out what strings that you can pull on is I think really important to avoiding sort of paralysis or just resignment or nihilism. Yeah, so thank you for that. So some other types of actions people are suggesting, the K-pop stands, very important. Thank you for that. Mags, what is a phone zap?
A phone zap is, in my understanding, I know it from like prison abolition work, of just getting a bunch of people to call specific numbers at a specific time just to do a bunch of stuff.
Okay.
Might be like a specific script.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, open letters and op-eds, way to get in the media, strikes, absolutely, like a general strike, online petitions, boycotts, yes. So both labor and purchasing, absolutely. So this is a great list we have, and there are, of course, there's a campaign and action for all occasions. And I'm going to turn it over to Hoyan here to just have a sort of moment of reflection as we think about what is a good one to choose and why we would choose one versus another.
For sure, yeah. I think you all came up with really cool tactics. For some reason, it always makes me like really excited when I hear about organizing tactics. So I'm like, oh yeah, like that's so cool, or like that's happening, right? Like right now in where I am, the grad students are striking and the resident advisors are now striking, and it's really cool. A lot of things to think about though as we're thinking of all this stuff, right? Because it can seem so immense. There are so many tactics that we can use. We can just throw them and be like, what if we did all these at once, right? Because they all exist, and in some ways they were effective. But it's important too, particularly as we begin brainstorming, to think about risk, consent, and also someone's relationship to the state. So in what ways might an action be putting somebody else at risk? If you are documented or undocumented, where are we putting other people? We talked about the neighborhood that we're doing these actions in. If we do an action in a specific area, who are we maybe, what's our relationship to those folks? What could it look like to have an action there? And then also thinking about just in general, like who is our action pushing and why are we doing that? And is it worth the risk or the amount of work that we're doing? Risk component aside, there's also a lot of strategic components to thinking through why we might want to do a specific action, right? So when we looked at the power map and we pulled out the CEO of Trinity Health, we can look at specific actions that may or may not actually have an impact on that CEO. And there are also actions that may have a huge impact on that CEO. So I think I'm going to kick that out to you all to think about for a second and get back to me on that. And I'll give you an example in the meantime. So we just finished doing some mutual aid work in the area that I am in. And through that, we actually tried to advocate for folks to get more funding for housing, more funding for bills, etc. We could have chosen to pressure the governor or just kidding, that was the answer, whatever. We could have chosen to pressure like a city council person maybe, which could make sense because that person has some position of power and they have stuff to do with housing, but actually they can't do anything, right? So we could have all these beautiful tactics laid out. We could write op-eds to them. We could go outside their house. We could do a power map for them, but they're not the right target. So when we're thinking through the strategies and the tactics that we want to do, we really want to be thinking about the people and also what our overall goal is and who's involved with that. So Peter is going to now pull out a bigger list of things that we had come up with. And actually, if folks wanted to just think about maybe some tactics that they might want to use when we show the bigger list, folks can shout those out as well then too.
So I think we got a lot of these. Were mentioned by folks, and obviously there are a few others on here as well. But I think some things to consider when we look at these, and tying it back to what Hoyan was saying as well, is that there's an escalating ladder of these that is also something you want to consider, both for who are your members, what's the community, and also, do we want to start with yeah, absolutely. I can explain weed pasting. So weed pasting is basically like putting up posters. Yes. So it's like a glue that's like really, really difficult to remove. And yeah, great. And so just considering that there's a ladder of escalation to these actions as well. I think for an example around here is that We were trying to, Mike Quigley is the congressperson for the, thank you, Mags. Just a reminder, when you are wheat pasting, razor the edges so that the posters are harder to remove. So excellent suggestion. But so an example around here of when you might want to escalate a campaign is we, members of Students for National Health Program, we're trying to meet with local representatives to talk to them about single payer. And Mike Quigley, who's a Democrat but doesn't support single payer, wouldn't meet with us and ignored us. We did a canvassing in his neighborhood, tried a bunch of times to reach out to him, and eventually started, pre-COVID, had some actions where we went and disrupted his petition to get back on the ballot, which he thought was just going to be a formality. And a group of us went in there and disrupted that until we were escorted off and went to his office and delivered about 1,000 signed postcards. So we started sort of playing nice and then began working our way up the ladder to try to put more and more pressure on him. And at each step, inviting journalists to come and observe that. So can we just think a little bit about like that ladder of escalation and maybe why one particular type of action would be effective? You can use it in the context of a specific target or a specific campaign if you want, but just want to get some practice in reflecting on why we would choose one versus another.
Hi, I have an example I could share.
Great, thank you.
This is Bree, by the way. In my department, we have a really pretty responsive group of professors and advisors. So when we come to them with issues and we support other demands and they're listening to us, that means that we can continue sort of doing, I guess, things on the lower end of that scale versus trying to like have a big occupation of the department when they were supportive would kind of be counterproductive.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a great example, and thank you for sharing that. Does anybody else have anything they want to add? I do want to be conscious of time here and that we are getting down to the last couple minutes. Okay, if that's the case, I'm going to move on. So we also want to, we say we've picked a particular tactic or campaign that we want to use. And maybe perhaps it's a variety where we're going to write some op-eds and we're going to hold an action. Now what do we do? Like, how do we actually pull something like that off? I think this gets at the point of it feels so big. How do we do this work? And I would love to hear what folks think are like the skills that we as organizers need to be able to pull off the campaign strategy that we've chosen.
And I think something to think about too is like, even how are we getting people in a meeting, or like what are the different components that we might need to pull off this campaign? Not just like, oh, okay, I see, yeah, people get it. Yeah,
so John Javi, I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Please correct me. But yeah, organizing and delegating the work among the group via distributive leadership. I mean, I think I love that one because it's a practical logistical thing of there are tasks that need to be done. And it also goes back to that definition of leadership where, how did you put it, of creating a leaderful movement?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a quote though. Someone else came up with that.
Okay. Well, it's a great quote. So, slowing down, doing all the planning, making amazing power maps, absolutely. If you have different colored pens, please bust them out. Facilitation skills, childcare, really, really important. Thank you for bringing up both of those. Making people feel warm and included, a warm hello. Food helps, pre-COVID, of course. Wash your hands, wear your mask. So this is, I think what we're getting at here is that we know how to do a lot of these things already. We just don't always do them in this context. And so being intentional about the spaces we create, about providing for people's human needs. They have kids, they need to eat food. Great, Maya. Logistics, the understanding of messaging and comms positions, opening up space for folks to contribute in the ways they feel called. Yes. So building that community and listening to folks and bringing them in, also being strategic about your messaging, maybe defining some roles within the group, having accessible language. Yes. So these are the nuts and bolts that, pulling off any type of initiative are essential to it. And I think things like accessible language, facilitation skills, distributive leadership also speak to the fact that as we do these logistical tasks, we can still be intentional and build, create a vision or a model for the type of world that we want to see in our internal organizing as well. So in a way, they're things we've seen in every institution we've ever interacted with, and in another way, they're sort of visionary in how we try to create intentional spaces that we organize in. So that's great. Thank you, everybody, for contributing. I'm going to move on here. Again, we've talked about this, security considerations, which is beyond the scope of this, but something we'd want to think about as well. I think being conscious of our time, I'm going to pass it off to Hoi-An, and we're going to try to wrap it up in the next couple minutes here. So things might be a little fast.
Yes, I mean, I went over this before. I forgot the slide order, but really when we're thinking through tactics and skills, that all helps us choose what we want to be doing, right? And something that I do want to pull out quickly from what you all just came up with of the skills you need to have is that a lot of those skills, if you're good at those, that makes you a better doctor. Like a lot of those skills are the skills, or better medical professional. Sorry, I was staring at Peter, but those are the skills that help you be better medical professionals and better proponents in the healthcare system in general. And also the skills that to some degree are really valued by your patients and by folks in the communities that you're working with, right? So these don't go against what you're already doing, but in fact, it's just a different way to apply them. So if we're thinking about then what we've learned as a whole throughout this whole session, we can go to the next one, is we've identified what we're fighting for, and we've identified who we're fighting with. And what we've wanted to do throughout this is to help people give the skills of how we're fighting and how we're going to be able to pull together everything that we've learned about, not just for Mercy Hospital, but maybe in a different scenario. Organizing, it's not always linear, right? Like we're not always going to go A to Z. Sometimes we might skip around, but there are some concrete steps that we can always pull out, and that we did try to pull out for you today, that help you figure out where to go, and at least in what direction that you can be pointing to, which really helped build our campaigns and also help us all build movements and come into our power. So I'll kick it off to Akila to close us out.
Thank you. We want to bring everyone back to the grounding that this is a developing issue. There are a lot of people on the ground here in Chicago who are working against closure of Mercy Hospital. We especially want to highlight the community groups such as Journey for Justice, Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, Black Leaders Building Together Coalition, Stories of Mercy on Instagram, the Teamsters team. They're all working together, and if you are interested in contributing to the campaigns, please follow them and see what they need. Since this is a public procedure according to the state of Illinois' rules, there's going to be a public hearing, which the date is still to be determined. But if you go to the Illinois, the government's website by 6th of October, you can file public written comments. The website is a little bit tricky, so you have to fiddle around a bit to figure out where you can give a comment about Trinity Health. We want to highlight an action that's happening tomorrow afternoon at 51st and King, and that's a car caravan starting point, and it's going to go around the south side near Mercy. So please come out and support if you want to support the Teamsters Local 743. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. We have a feedback form for this session. If you would be so kind as to provide us some feedback. We're also going to be emailing that out to you, so don't feel like you need to do that right now. We have 2 more sessions coming up in the upcoming 2 weeks, so note that time down. Please RSVP. We'll be emailing those out as well. And Peter, you can move to the next slide. And we now have a website where we're cataloging the sessions and keeping the recordings. So please take your time to watch it, keep an eye out on our events, and thank you so much for joining. That's it from us, folks. We can stop the recording.